Hello everyone. This is a little odd to be speaking at you from the other side of the world and participating on a panel like this, talking into a camera, but I really do appreciate Nandini for going out of her way to make it possible for me to sort of come in by video. So thanks again, Nandini, and thanks to the Hindu Life Festival for making it possible. Before I start, I just want to say thanks to Susan, who's sitting there and who I haven't seen for years in person. I would have loved to be there with you and with everyone else. Susan published my book through Spinifex Press and also, made it possible in many ways, was a mentor throughout the process. So nice to be on a panel with you, Susan, and thank you. Okay, so before I start, Nandini's asked me to do a short reading. I'll just give you a brief overview of the book to put it in some sort of context. My sister Chaos, and sorry, I'm sort of half reading off a piece of paper here as well, so excuse me for doing that. My sister Chaos is about two sisters who have had to leave their home country because of war and who end up as refugees in an unnamed second country. It's set largely in the house and workplace of one of the sisters, who is a cartographer, and she is embarking on this sort of intense, mad strategy to map the world around her in extensive detail, and starting with her house. Meanwhile, her sister, who is a painter, arrives unexpectedly, and she's on a different mission. Her mission is to find the lover and the son that she got separated from in the war that made them refugees. And the two separate quests of the sisters, if you like, start to become entangled and entwined as the book goes on. So the scene I'm going to read is from a later part of the novel where they have become entwined. The cartographer's sister has taken her map hostage, and in order to get it back, the cartographer needs to help her sister find the place where her lover and son were last held. To do that, the cartographer needs to access mapping data from her old country that she has actually kept secretly on a USB stick and has been hiding from everyone, colleagues in her last country and colleagues in her new country, who would all be interested in this data because it's from a big international project called the Global Map Project, which really exists. So the cartographer, in order to get this data for her sister, needs to access a particular software, and this software is only available in her new workplace. But she doesn't have open access to it. She needs to get the help of a colleague. And she goes to see such a sympathetic colleague, a mathematician who she's relatively friendly with. So the scene starts in that is the mathematician's office. And the first person is the cartographer. I reach under my collar and hook my finger around the strip of fabric that holds the memory stick. I draw it out of my shirt, pull it over my head, and hold it forward to her, its metallic surface shining in my right palm. The strip of fabric curls and falls between my fingers. The mathematician looks from my eyes to my palm and back again. "What's on it?" she asks. I don't know where to start. She hesitates, then leans forward and takes it between her thumb and forefinger. Her fingertips barely graze the skin of my palm. The strip of fabric ripples through my fingers and is gone. It's all gone. She has it in her hand. I feel raw, as if I've lost the upper layer of my skin, and am sensitive to her every displacement of air. With her thumb, she pushes back the hinged cover of the memory stick and slides the exposed metallic tip of the USB stick into the port of her computer. She looks over at me. "What is it?" she asks again. I close my own hand and put it in my pocket, draw out the folded strip of newspaper and smooth it on my lap. The coordinates are listed in pencil in my sister's clumsy hand. There are points where the pencil has gone through the paper, as my sister wrote, without a surface to lean against, next to the wall. I look up. The mathematician is looking at the screen. "Can I open these files?" she asks. I want to say no. I want to grab back the memory stick and leave. I fear, unreasonably, that in clicking the mouse she will open me up, that I will be exposed. But I'm not guilty of anything. I have the right to have a map of my country, to carry it with me. I have the right to keep it to myself. This is my data more than anyone's. I made it. She turns back to me. Is that what you want? She asks. I swivel the chair one way and the other in a tight rhythm. What choice do I have anyway, if I want my map back? I nod. I hear her double click, pause, double click again. She frowns at the screen. What language is this? She asks. Mine, I say. She glances up, then looks back at the files. I watch her clicking and sliding and clicking the mouse as she moves through the files. I'm going to have to explain. She's not going to know what to look for. Then she says, where did these come from? They look like global map files. I remember then that there is the same way of organising the files in the different countries. One raster and 4 vector application formats in the first folder, and then once you open them up, the same layout for each. The final folder is labelled with a single letter. The whole project is, after all, about international consistency. She stops clicking and looks up at me. How did you get this data? She asks. It's mine, I say. What country is it for? Mine. She leans back again, folds her arm and tilts her head at me. I thought it was all lost, she says. I laugh, as if it was something funny but not very important. So did I lie. She doesn't move. She smiles slightly, but only because I'm smiling. When I stop, so does she. I decide to tell her. Most of it, not all of it. I omit things, like my sister. And I add others, like the bit where I thought I'd lost the USB stick, where it had slipped into the lining of my suitcase and only fell out because I was trying to put the case on top of my wardrobe because I had to tilt it to get it up there. And luckily, I'd forgotten to zip the case closed because otherwise the stick wouldn't have slid out. It would have stayed in there and I might not have found it for another 2 years. It's details like this that make a story sound convincing, I'm told. But she just stares at me across the desk. Why did you bring it to me? She asks. Because I can't access the software. I can't open the files. What's that? She asks, nodding at the strip of newspaper in my lap. The reason I need to. Okay, I'll leave it there and let Nandini pass on to the next part. So Nandini's first question for me is, fiction is often inspired by non-fiction. Would you like to talk about some of what made you write My Sister Chaos? I'll keep this one brief because I find it really difficult to answer. I think that like probably what drives the authors of a lot of like first novels, when it's the first time you've written anything, it's all the obsessions that you've been carrying with you all your life. For me, that was obsessions around how we represent our world and how we make meaning of our world, and particularly the paradoxes that are inherent to that process, whether through something as logical and orderly as cartography or whether through artistic processes. There are also these ideas or patterns, if you like, to do with exile, which is the title of the panel today, and particularly lesbian exile. So I was really interested in the parallels between exile from country and the refugee experience, which I'd had a fair bit of sort of professional experience in my work as a human rights activist, and then a sort of interior exile from your own family or community that is the experience of a lot of lesbians and gay men and others. And I wanted to sort of break open the sort of the similarities between these different forms of exiles, and then the layering, or what we call intersectionality, of when those things come together, because both of the sisters are sort of exiled and talk about being exiles before the war made it formal, and have experienced that firsthand. So I think I'll leave it there. Okay, so Nandini's second question. Both Susan and Lara have spoken about the persecution of lesbian women, Australia, of course, had a historic vote on gay marriage recently. Of what significance is this to you? Okay, so I could talk a lot about the vote on gay marriage. I think there's lots of ways to come at it. I work as a sort of activist and policymaker as well, so I have very strong opinions on it from a political perspective. And from a political perspective, I think it was a destructive and opportunistic sham, basically, in terms of a vote, in terms of the way the process was done. We had no need constitutionally or legally or in any aspect of our democratic systems to put that to a plebiscite. It was done for highly political reasons. And when you put the question of whether a minority should have its rights to a majority vote, I think it actually undermines your democracy and doesn't strengthen it. So that would be my take on it politically. From a perspective of whether it's creating social change and whether it's going to, reduce persecution, discrimination against lesbians and gay men in future, I think that we're yet to find out. Having a plebiscite itself, I think, from a social change perspective, can risk sort of calcifying the opinions of those who are voting, because if you're sort of nailing your colours to the mast, you're forced to articulate something that you might not yet have articulated, which can work both ways. If you decide to come down on you're for it, you're supporting lesbians and gay men to get married, then that's a positive thing. If you decide that you're against it, then it's no matter how society changes in future, no matter how your own views might change, it's a difficult thing to admit you're wrong always. And sort of analyses of voting behaviour show that people often go on to support an issue or the issues that a politician they've voted for support because they don't want to admit fault, even if they're starting to shift themselves. So there's that issue with the plebiscite. There's obviously, though, a huge number of positives to the result of the plebiscite, which is that equal marriage has now been brought into law, which is great for those of us that want to get married. So and also for social norms, it's a simple equality of treatment before the law that is, I think, necessary for any democracy. So on a personal note, though, I would just say it did have a certain significance to me because it made me realise how much social norms have shifted in my own lifetime. To get to a point where 2/3 of the population voted yes for equal marriage, I mean, that would just not have happened, I think, even 10 years ago, let alone 30 years ago. It did have the downside of making you think, well, that means 1 in 3 don't think you're equal. And, every time you're in the queue at the supermarket or on a bus or in a meeting or whatever, you think 1 person in 3 here doesn't think I should have the same rights. That's tricky. And where I grew up in the suburbs of Western Sydney, it was 2 in 3 voted against. So that makes going home harder. And whether it will have an impact on more substantive changes to social norms and the ways in which LGBTI people are treated remains to be seen, I think. Obtaining legal equality is, as you know, and anyone who's a woman, a person of colour, has a disability will understand, is that really only the first step in any process towards a more substantive equality. So, yeah, I think we've still probably got a fair way to go on that. I just realised that for the last question, I did no analysis of the institution of marriage. Susan will do it. So the next question that Dee has put to me is my favourite. She says, I love how you use language, cartographic relief, you say in the book, and the language and identity of these women is not known. It seems to me symbolic of the systematic erasure of women's writing down the ages, a recurring theme in both Looper and Lamb and Dark Matters by Susan too. Yes. Any thoughts on reclaiming words, on making new languages and structures? Yeah, I think that for me that's the theme and the heart of the book, in that both sisters are engaged in this activity of trying to create meaning in new ways, and finding a new sort of, not a new, but trying to use existing visual languages, that is cartography and painting, to make visible an experience that is not otherwise visible. And they're both in each of their different endeavours, they're struggling with the sort of structures and processes of how you do that, of representation, of how you make meaning, or translate experience into meaning. And it's really, it's not by chance that I made the sisters these characters of these professions of a cartographer and a painter. It's because I really thought that would convey that theme and its relationship to these themes of exile and displacement, and what it means to be marginalised or at the centre. The cartographer, in fact, even sort of, I think, takes it a step further. She believes that cartography is actually an improvement on reality, because it makes visible sort of fine-grained detail that isn't visible to the naked eye, and that you can only pick up by measuring with her sort of complex tools, her sensitive tools. So she thinks that cartography actually illuminates reality in a way that just looking at reality can't. And she goes a step further as well, to not give it away, but sort of later in the novel, she actually undertakes this action that works to shift the very frame of reference of cartography, to put herself at the centre in an act that is about sort of recentering herself as a sort of marginalised individual. And I think, just because I love this question so much, Nandini, you also spoke, I think, about erasure and the erasure of women's identities and what they produce sort of creatively. And Susan will be able to talk about this much better than I. But in My Sister Chaos, this choice not to name the sisters, and not to name the country, not to name the war, was deliberate as well, and it was designed to sort of create that sort of sense of invisibility, of almost a non-identity. So the sisters are the only ones to speak each other's names in the book. We know that other people speak them, but they mispronounce them, or they confuse them. And of all the characters in the book, only the sisters sort of share a language. And that's an attempt by me to sort of try and convey this sense of them only being real and visible to each other, and otherwise being sort of erased by their society, and their relationship to the outside world as being one of sort of dislocation. Okay, great question. Okay, Nandini's next question for me was, for writers, there is a personal time with a book before the editor has seen it, and again a shared time with just the editor before the public has seen it. You seem to extend this time naturally by using cartographic vocabulary, and she says, is this an acceptable phrase? I don't know, it sounds good to me, which keeps the audience at a certain distance from the main character, who clearly needs her space and silence. So I took it, Nandini, as your question being about the main character using this sort of really dense and obscure language and vocabulary that had to do with the technicalities of cartography as a way of sort of maintaining a special or personal place with the book, which is a great question. But I can't really claim that that's what I was doing. I think it wasn't intentional, basically. I actually think I believe that I did research on cartography as I was writing the book, and I got more and more obsessive about it. And I think, in my inexperience, it's the first book, I think I just sort of assumed a reader that would follow me into this sort of intricate detail, and a reader that would actually take the time to read through these dense paragraphs of cartographic language and actually try to make sense of them. So I think, I think it's a flaw. It's a lack of thoughtfulness towards the reader. I'm glad you can put another interpretation on it, because it seems to me that in a way you can read it and just sort of skip over that really dense language and go, here she goes, and see that as her in her personal space. So thank you. That's very nice of you, but not intentional. What do I want to say? The other side of that is that I took a lot of poetic license with cartography as well, in that I think her intentions are not strictly cartographic, if you see what I mean. She makes of her map making something beyond what a professional cartographer would make or be doing. She sort of wobbles off into not a small amount of magical thinking. So and that sort of again, that entwining of cartography with an artistic effort is something I'm trying to get to, I think, there. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Okay, so Nandini's next question. An Indian lesbian told me she is tired of the discourse around violence when it comes to lesbian writing. She said, "We're queer women not because of violence, no. We're queer because we feel desire for each other." And I thought that was beautifully put. She also said queer women's writing will have truly arrived when one can talk about the narrative of desire and pleasure rather than violence alone. What are your thoughts on this? Do you agree or disagree? I actually wrote notes for this one and went into a bit of a rant. So Nandini, you might not be using this clip because I think it will go on for some time. In short, I think the second part of what your friend said is spot on. We're queer because we feel desire for each other, and beautifully put. I think the first part, we're queer women not because of violence, no, is a bit off. It's a misrepresentation in that I can't think of any example in any form of discourse where that's the assumption, that we're queer because of violence. The assumption is that we experience higher rates of violence, and that's an assumption that's actually a fact. It's backed up by a huge amount of data. But we experience that not because we're queer, we experience it because others are homophobic. So that's an important distinction. But I think that's not what your friend is objecting to. Your friend's objecting to whether or not this fact should dominate discourse. And that as well is sort of worth unpacking. I think if we're talking about the discourse that's aiming at social change, like an activist discourse, if you like, then it makes a lot of sense that we'd be identifying what needs to change, the problems, the issues, the abuses, such as violence, rather than the things that are going really well, like pleasure and desire. Nothing to really advocate for or protest against there. I think the same if we're talking about discourse in a sense of media. You know, basically, lesbian has orgasm is not news. You know, what can I say? Hate crimes are and should be, and that's sort of the way news media operates. So if she's talking about discourse as in popular culture discourse, as in, you know, I don't know, highbrow literary discourse, then that's that's another issue. And of course, then my answer would be, of course, it should include narratives of desire and pleasure. And I would argue it does. It does, surely. So I'm not, I can think of several authors. Susan will be able to sort of give a reading list, no doubt, because she's one of the most erudite people on lesbian fiction that I know. Even among Spinifex authors, Suniti Namjoshi and, you know, feminist fables and her poetry, and Gillian Hanscom's novel for that matter, sort of really, you know, centralised desire and pleasure. And I was even thinking some really best-selling, almost mainstream lesbian authors, if there is such a thing, like Jeanette Winterson and Sarah Waters, full of it, desire, pleasure all over the place. And then I even said, and Gertrude Stein's wife was having a cow nearly 100 years ago now. So I don't think it's a particularly new thing. So I'm not, I just can't agree with what your friend is saying. I think, of course we need a narrative of desire and pleasure. I think we already have it. I don't think it's an either or to narratives of violence. There's no hierarchy to that. We write about what we experience, and we have a huge spectrum of experience. And what it is legitimate for queer women to write about is whatever it is that queer women are writing about. It's not for any of us to go, okay, this is appropriate. I want to see more of that, less of that. And I'll tell you when, you know, queer women's writing has arrived in some way. Yes. So yes, part of what your friends have beautifully put, a lot to unpack though, I think there. Okay, so Nandini's next question is about bodies and writing, and she talks about her own experience as a dancer and says it feeds into her writing. And she also mentions Murakami saying that it's important to be fit to write, which I wasn't aware of, but I read up on it when I saw your question. And yeah, really interesting, getting into shape for writing. So the question is about how dance and writing feed into each other. And I know you're going to ask Susan a similar question about being an aerialist. I found this such food for thought, because they so do, but I can't work out how. Because I was thinking about dance is it's almost the opposite in some ways. It's so physical in the sense of it's part of the real. It's the physical reality in space and in this sort of and in time as well. It's absolutely in the here and now. And I remember noting that that's just otherwise not a very big part of my life, the here and now. And it's not a very big part of writing as well, which is a flood of imagination where you can go to, you're in other locations, other times, constantly. But there is something about dancing, the feeling of dancing, and that incredible sort of physical and temporal realness of it that feels like writing, and especially like a first draft or early drafts, which is that period of sort of letting go and trying to get into a sort of flow or zone and being cut off from the world, like really absolutely 100% concentrating on what you're doing. So I can't say what it is that links them. I know that they feel the same. Later drafts of writing, no. Later drafts, when you get into editing, not so much. That's a completely different process and doesn't feel like dancing at all. It feels like plodding along a little bit, stepping one foot in front of the other. But yeah, those early drafts, definitely. There's something almost visceral about writing. There's something very sensual about it. Almost a little bit sexy sort of writing. And that's as far as I got with your question. I'd be really interested to hear what Susan says and what your own experience is too, Nandini, because I think it's a fascinating one. Okay, so I'm going to take the liberty of doing your last two questions together, Nandini, if I may. The first was, over the millennia, women are often portrayed as each other's enemies, and this is particularly true of mothers and daughters, of sisters. Sibling rivalry is the convenient term used. But women are shown to hate each other, undermine each other through the history of literature written by men. And you've asked me to talk about subverting this trope. And the second question that I think I'll bring together, because I think they're very much related, is so much of women's writing about women harks back to the mad woman in the attic trope. And what are my thoughts on this? So the reason I think they're related is that, so I don't know if you will have talked for your audience's sake about the book Mad Woman in the Attic. Was it Gilbert and Gubar, I think, written in the late 70s. Analysis of sort of Victorian literature. It's one of my favourite books. I think it was really well done. That sort of talked about this sort of literary trope based on, I think it was Jane Eyre, of a crazy woman that's husband of Mr. Rochester who's locked in the attic, and that being a metaphor for the sort of behaviour that women aren't allowed, or even or what it is when women write, like this sort of creative beast that they have. And you're absolutely right, Nandini, in picking up on that, in that in my book, My Sister Chaos, I was actually had that in mind with this idea of the different levels in the house that the cartographer is mapping, and these two women living on different levels at one point, and the idea that one of them is the mad woman in the other's attic or the mad woman in the other's basement. Because I think it's such a powerful sort of metaphor, and what it goes to is this idea of what is acceptable female behaviour, and we know that historically the sort of window, if you like, or range of what is acceptable female behaviour under patriarchy has been defined very narrowly, and has to be prized open further and further. Arguably, it's still pretty narrow. And it's in fact not even a range of behaviour that it's almost possible to fit within as a real human being that has experiences and emotions and feelings. So the suggestion, I think, in both Mad Woman in the Attic and in your question about women being portrayed as each other's enemies, is that women themselves sort of participate in this policing of other women's behaviours and in sort of not negating, but sort of criticising behaviours that fall outside the spectrum of what's considered sort of respectable. But that really, because that window or that spectrum is so narrow, really what it is that we're policing or criticising is other versions of ourselves. And I think that's the idea that you're getting to in your question, Nandini. And so yes, subverting that trope is I think really important, and showing a fuller range of female behaviour and experience is really important. And in My Sister Chaos, I do deliberately use this idea of the sisters as being possibly these two sides of the same coin, or it's even left open that they might even be the same person. They may be different, they may be the same, but that idea of they're different versions of a similar self. Yes, what else do I want to say about that? I'm just quickly checking my notes. Oh yeah, and I like the idea in The Mad Woman of the Attic of the idea that the suppression of those sort of more dangerous forms of the self leads to that woman in the attic or in the basement or whatever wreaking havoc on your life. And the other idea I actually think was a useful one to draw from The Mad Woman in the Attic is this idea of there being two texts, a palimpsest. I always say that wrong, palimpsest, I think it is, where you have one below the other. And that if you can read Jane Eyre and these, this Victorian literature as two different sorts of text, one of which is very acceptable and one of which is subversive all the way. And I like that idea and played with that a bit in My Sister Chaos as well, with the idea of the text of the map and the text of the painting that at different points in the book are hidden under each other. Yes, that's it. And that's it for my questions as well. So thanks again, everyone, and bye.